Hello and welcome to Why Laos. I'm your host, David Peter. This is a podcast that tries its best to explain to you what it's like living in a place 8,000 miles away from the place you grew up. For many of you, Southeast Asia probably conjures up a lot of images of exotic wildlife. And having been here all these years now, I've definitely gotten close and personal with more wildlife than might be considered desirable. If you're wondering if this is a part of the world with giant spiders and cockroaches the size of your hand, well, yes it is. Our current place is on the outskirts of the city. These houses are not the New England clapboard type, effectively saran-wrapped off from the outdoors. Lao houses basically leave the welcome mat out for everything that happens to crawl, fly, or slither by. Most Lao bathrooms don't have a separate shower stall or bathtub, just a drain in the floor by the toilet. Recently, my wife told me to come see something in the bathroom. At the bottom of the tiled wall, where some grout was missing, was a strange black shape. And right there, where we take our showers, was a scorpion claw, waving about from below, apparently hoping to catch a big one. So much for my wife sleeping that night. In addition to scorpions, we've had mice, frogs, toads, lizards, moths the size of a sparrow, and spiders so big you can hear their footsteps. Our cat goes bananas chasing the hundreds of geckos scurrying around the house, leaving their little gecko poos all over the place. And our cat in turn leaves little bits of geckos scattered everywhere. Speaking of geckos, here we've got the tokay. These guys can get as long as your forearm, have no eyelids to cover those big reptile eyes, and are known to bite when threatened. They also bark, almost like a small dog. As you may know, geckos can scale any wall and even walk on ceilings. This was impressed on me during our first trip to Laos when we stayed at an eco-lodge. The hot weather and new foods were giving me a little trouble in the intestinal way, and I had to make liberal use of the facilities there. The bungalows were made in the traditional Lao style of wood and thatched bamboo that embraced all the surrounding nature. While regretting some of that day's spicy food, I decided to shine the flashlight at the ceiling and saw about 20 sets of dead shark eyes and uncomfortably large bodies staring down at me. I felt well looked after. This podcast deals mainly with things happening in the country of Laos, hence the name Why Laos. But because many of the countries here in Southeast Asia are small and many shared borders, there are a lot of similarities between these countries, and many times us expats will find ourselves crossing over to some of these close-by nations, like Thailand, for instance. Thailand and Laos share a border, and share a lot more than that, really. Laos and Thailand have very similar cultures, languages, and environment. Matter of fact, much of northern Thailand was once part of Laos a long, long time ago. So now, we're going to hear from Jeremy, who has been in Thailand for quite some time, and for most of his time there, he has been in the city of Bangkok, and he has had some interesting run-ins with the wildlife there. And speaking of animals, you may hear roosters crowing in the background once in a while, which were recorded unintentionally during this interview to give you a little more flavor of the surroundings. So, how long have you been in Thailand?
For 15 years.
Wow, a long time. I bet you've seen your fair share of crazy stuff.
We have. Most of our time has been in Bangkok, and it is a very, very interesting city, and there's so many things to see that you would think you've seen it all by now, but you just haven't.
Just to begin with, have you ever been bitten or attacked by any wildlife in Southeast Asia?
Thankfully, no. And actually, I've never even been bitten by a dog in Thailand. So, yeah, it's been a good run of no attacks.
In the urban streets of Bangkok, you can see plenty of wildlife. Just like any other major city, you have lots of brats. But a very Southeast Asian thing, there are tons of stray dogs running around. But things that we would never see in major cities in the West, Bangkok has exotic wild animals roaming the streets, like very large monitor lizards. You can also sometimes see monkeys bouncing around. And
there's a lot of snakes in Bangkok as well, and not just little snakes, like big, like pythons and so forth.
To name just a few of the snakes you may see slithering around Bangkok are yellow-spotted keelbacks, pit vipers, monocled cobras, and reticulated pythons, which is the largest snake in the world, by the way, and can reach to over 20 feet long in a major city.
Yeah, surprising number of snakes. More snakes in the city in Bangkok than I ever saw in Canada in the wild. So my wife and I had an interesting experience with a large snake. We were walking to an appointment, and off to the left there was a bit of a crowd gathered, and a fella in coveralls, and he had a big kind of, I think it was a rice sack, empty, and he had a big stick with a noose on it. And I said to my wife, I think this is one of those snake guys.
One of these snake guys?
In the city, they have guys that will capture snakes for the safety of the people, and then they go re-release them and so forth in safer areas. But it had just rained that night, and in the morning it stopped, and I had heard of the sewers filling, and then the snakes have nowhere to go. You don't see snakes on the street, ever. I've never seen one on the street. But they will come up out of the sewers because they got nowhere to go. In the cold season, we saw some big snakes on the road, I think because the road was warm, and some of them carried on. A couple of them had been hit by cars, but like big poisonous snakes. But this one in Bangkok, we didn't actually see the snake. We saw he had a pole with like a noose on it, and he was lowering, we saw the head, but he was lowering it into this big empty rice sack. And I was kind of alarmed, but it wasn't moving, it wasn't dead, nobody seemed to be in danger. But what I remember is the sack was big, and he lowered the snake into the sack, and then at the base, the snake seemed to kind of curl up at the bottom, naturally, I guess. And so, just like anything, he snugged the sack at the bottom and he twisted it around. He gave the snake plenty of room to move if he needed to, and it was like a permeable sack so it could breathe. And then he tied it, and then he lifted this thing up, and it was pretty heavy because he wasn't just picking up like a bag of trash. He was picking up something pretty heavy. Well, the way he was putting it in the bag and the height of the bag, the snake had to have been, I'm guessing, probably at least 6 feet long. And then when the bag was closed, you could see a good 6 or 7 inches of bag. So even if the snake was only half of that, that would mean the snake was still 3 or 4 inches thick. Yeah, so I was guessing it was probably a python of some kind. We've seen them around, like on the canals and so forth. And then what do? You strap it to the back part of the seat with bungee cords, and you drive away. So yeah, that was. I mean, we heard about it. We never seen it in action, but that day we did get to see it in action. It was very interesting, and everybody was safe. Everybody was happy. He looked happy. The snake seemed fine, and that was that.
We have dogs. I've always loved dogs, and they're great to have in places like Laos. My wife wasn't always convinced, but after moving to a new place with a proper yard, someone advised us it was time to get a dog. She was still skeptical that we needed the security, until they said a dog was not just for intruders, but for the critters. And those were the magic words. And that's when we got our first dog, Basa, a fat, furry Lao dog impersonating a German shepherd that got cut off at the knees. She's a stubby little thing, but her bark is outsized. Our dogs are known to bark at anything that moves, including plastic bags. One night while friends were staying with us, Basa just wouldn't shut up, so I went down to see what the peril was. It was a big cockroach. So you can just imagine how worked up they get at the herds of goats and cows that regularly walk by our house. Which is why one night when our dogs went berserk outside our kitchen, I didn't get too excited. Figured maybe they're letting a roach know it's not welcome. But since I also wanted some sleep that night, I decided to check it out. They were barking at a covered part of the drain that runs alongside our house. Think low-tech ground gutter with some flat cinder blocks covering part of it. Since it was getting dark and whatever had got their attention was undercover, I had to get the flashlight to see who our guest was. Now at this point, if you're thinking, but Dave, you haven't mentioned snakes yet in Laos, just the story of Jeremy in Thailand. Aren't there snakes in Laos too? Well, yes there are, and Yes, it was. A good-sized one, too. Not that I know anything about snakes, being from New England, but at least I could tell that it was big. And I thought, if I don't get rid of this thing, the dogs will keep us up all night barking at it. Coincidentally, we had just bought a handy-dandy snake grabber that's basically a long pole with a scissor-type clamp at one end and a handle to work it on the other. And I love tools. Also, I'm a bit stupid, so I figured this snake was history. Now, this snake was coiled up right in the middle of the covered part of the drain, and frankly feeling quite put out with all the commotion. So I got the grabber and ignored my wife repeatedly rattling on about being careful. But this snake most decidedly did not want to come out from under the cinder blocks. So I decided to remove the first couple blocks to get easier access. And at this point, I lost being in the same bedroom as my wife privileges for the night. But both Snake and I undeterred, I resorted to sticking my face in the drain with a flashlight to check on my progress. It was difficult to determine who was most upset now, the snake, our dogs, or my wife. It was quite a scene. I jammed the grabber down the drain, snapped the scissors, and I got it. I could feel its strength as it started to coil its way around the pole of the grabber. It was definitely much stronger than I expected. As I pulled it out from the drain, our dog Bassa lunged for it, and the cheesed-off snake opened its mouth and hissed at her. I have discovered that nothing gets my wife more whipped up than trying to catch a snake. Following the final victorious capturing, I felt very manly at this point. I have conquered nature. I felt a bit like Bear Grylls, I have to admit. We took a few pictures of this ginormous beast before I threw it over the wall. But after a round of high fives with the wife, I noticed Bassa didn't seem to be doing so well. She just laid down and looked very unhappy. Then her eye started swelling and closing up, and she got very lethargic. I checked her over for a bite somewhere and started frantically texting every Lao person I could think of, including pictures of the snake and my dog. Then all the answers start trickling back. David, that's a cobra. A cobra? Are you kidding me? In my Warner Brothers informed mind, I'd pictured cobras as black or brown and always having their hoods open and having very defined white diamonds in the back of their heads. After all these years in Laos, I had no idea that cobras could be a faded green. Now I was panicking, because my stupidity may have gotten my dog bitten by one of the most venomous snakes on the planet. Not to mention my wife or myself could have been bitten. Now in Laos, most places close their doors at 5 p.m., and the only way to get business numbers is either through a friend or through Facebook. After a bunch of dead ends, I finally got in touch with one vet. They confirmed it was a cobra, but said there was no anti-venom for dogs to be had in Laos. After some further frantic Googling and back and forth with the vet, we discovered the snake hadn't bitten Bassa. It had spit venom in her eye. Some cobras spit venom. Did you know that? I didn't know that. If you did know that, why didn't you tell me that before I moved to this place? But yes, our local brand of cobras can spit venom up to 2 to 3 meters, aim for the eyes, and have close to 100% accuracy. So when I was pulling this guy out from the drain and thought it hissed at my dog, it was actually spitting in her eye. Bassa had taken one for the team. But because of the late hour and no anti-venom to be had, all we could do was rinse her eye out and wait till morning. The next morning, Bassa's eye was completely swollen shut. We took her to the vet, who informed us that the venom could have still made it to the bloodstream via her eye, and often dogs would be maimed or die a day or two later. So after a couple anxious days of care at the vet, she happily made it home and in good shape. The moral of this story is, 1, Bassa is a hero, and 2, I know nothing. And as I get older, I realize how true that really is. Afterwards, everyone here who heard the story said, yeah, of course that was a cobra. Of course they can spit venom in your eye. Didn't you know that? Nope. I was born 8,000 miles away. So there you go. Some fun Southeast Asian critter stories. I know what you're thinking. I am never going there. To be honest, I can understand where you are coming from, but truth be told, we've never been hurt by any wild animals here. Not to say we never will, but we have gotten through pretty unscathed. So far. Thank you for listening to Why Laos. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, David Peter. All music was composed by me as well. Some rewriting and production was done by Tanya Felix. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and like it on any platform that you get podcasts. We'll see you next time.